So verse 1, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields, the cornfields, on the Sabbath. Now, if we don't understand those two words, the Sabbath, we're not going to have a Scooby what's going on in this episode. So, let me try and fill in a little bit of the backstory. Big Kobe is not here today, I don't think. I think he's working. But if you've ever met Big Kobe and you've ever asked Cobes, how are you? He only ever replies with one word. What's that one word? Doesn't say good. Doesn't say fine. Tired. It's the only word he ever says. How are you? Tired. That's the lived experience of God's people Israel at this stage in the story. They exhausted the meaning of the word exhausted. They'd been in brutal slavery to the brutal Egyptians under increasingly brutal conditions for a brutal 400 years. Tired doesn't even touch it. 400 years. Imagine 400 years, never a day off. Imagine 400 years, no rest. If you were part of God's people, that was your experience. You were born a slave, you lived a slave, you died a slave. But at this stage in the history, and you can read about this in the Bible book called Exodus, God hears their cries for mercy, and in his mercy, he rescues his people out of slavery. The picture that's often used in the Bible is, they were like sheep stuck in a pit, and God is the shepherd who lifts them out. And having rescued them from Egypt, he leads them to a mountain to meet, to relate to himself. And these are the first words he says. This is Exodus chapter 20. He says, God spoke all these words. I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So, he is their rescuer. They are rescued sheep. And this is when he gives them their 10 commandments. This is how you relate to me, having been rescued. And I'm going to read you the 4th commandment. And I want you to hear it as if all you've ever known is slavery. I want you to hear it as if your people have not had a day off for 400 years. Listen to it. God says, remember the Sabbath day, the rest day, by keeping it holy. 6 days you'll labor, do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath, a rest to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, the rest day, and made it holy. Now, if all you'd ever known was slavery for 400 years, how do you hear that command? In your head you're going, I've been languishing under the authority of someone who's worked me into the ground, who's broken my body, who's crushed my spirit, and has devalued me to being less than an animal. But now I've been rescued by someone who's used their authority to give me rest. In fact, they are commanding that I rest. They are ensuring that I no longer go, not 400 years, not even 6 days without a day of rest. And far from relating to me like a creature, he is inviting me into the rest of the Creator. Imagine how that sounds as a former slave. Sabbath means rest. And here he says it is a rest that has been blessed. You know what blessed means? It just means happy. This is a holy happiness. Once a week. Some of us need that, looking at your faces. It's okay to be happy. This is a holy happiness. Holy just means different. There's a sense in which that's different from the other 6 days of your week. But I think even here he's saying it's going to be different from your past. You're no longer a slave, but you're invited to relate to the Creator as the place of rest. 1 day in every 7, off. Every 7th day different, so that you can Rejoice in remembering this rest of rescue. Do you hear the tone of the commandment? It's a blessed rest. It's a holy happiness. It's not restrictive. It's rest. It's not a burden on your back. It is a blessing to be enjoyed. He's following. And this rhythm of holy happiness, of rest one day in 7, continues as the rhythm of the week all the way until this moment where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a cornfield on the Sabbath day. Okay? So let's read on, Matthew 12. So, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some ears of corn and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this. Now that's another Bible word that we need to understand if we're going to get our heads into this passage. The Pharisees get a bad rep, and we often treat them as the kind of panto villains. So here they are in the cornfields behind Jesus and the disciples, and what would you do if it was a panto? Boo! They're behind you! That's the feel we get for the Pharisees a lot of the time. However, these lads were the spiritual leaders of God's people. They wanted to honour God's reputation. And so they dedicated their lives to the thorough application of God's word. That's what motivated them. It's a good motivation. They wanted to be pernickety and proper about the Ten Commandments. And we're going to see them do that to this Sabbath law. But what we're going to see is they got so lost in being pernickety about the commandment that they lost sight of the purpose of the commandment. They caused this switch to happen where they sabotage the Sabbath and turn it from rest into restriction and from blessing into burden. All right? And I want us to see two things about the Pharisees that show you a difference from what we've just seen the Sabbath was meant to be. Okay? So remember Sabbath, holy happiness, kind of blessed restness. All right? Here's two things about the Pharisees where they're sabotaging that. Here's the first thing. Number one, if you're taking notes. They fill the commandment with condemnation and they empty it of rest. Okay? They fill it with condemnation and they empty it of rest. So here's the scene. Jesus and his disciples are walking through the cornfields on the Sabbath and they are hungry. We're meant to read between the lines there and realize that these disciples are poor. They're not quite sheep stuck in a pit, but they are starving in the pit of their stomachs. However, God's heart for the poor meant that he had made provisions in his law for the poor. Farmers were meant to harvest the main part of the field, but leave the edges so that if poor people were hungry, they could come and harvest from the edge of the field and eat. Now, maybe that's why Jesus had led them through this cornfield on the way to the synagogue. He had seen their need, and so he's taken a route to meet their need. But where God and where Jesus see disciples who are unfed, these Pharisees just see disciples who are being unlawful. So if you look at verse 2, there's no care, just crit. And there's no instinct to provide, there's just instinct to prosecute. They go, you're picking corn on the Sabbath. That's working. Lawbreaker. And they double up. If you're not just picking it but eating it, means you're threshing on the Sabbath. I don't know what threshing means, but I think to eat you have to thresh. You're threshing on the Sabbath. Lawbreakers. You see what they've done? They have turned rescued people back into what? Slaves. Rather than the Sabbath for them being about blessing, they've begun to load onto people like a burden. And rather than the Sabbath being about blessed rest, they've made it about restrictions. Rather than a day of celebration, they've weaponized it for condemnation. Now, do you see how far that feels from God saying to slaves, once a week, take a day of rest? So different. It's miles from that. Now, let me give you the second thing, because that instinct and impulse in them reveals what's going on inside of them. So not only have they filled the commandment with condemnation and they've emptied it of rest, secondly, inside them they are dedicated to sacrifices, but they're devoid of mercy. And now I'm getting that language from verse 7, right? Dedicated to sacrifices, devoid of mercy. Look at verse 7. Jesus says to them, if you'd known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Now, that's a verse from the Old Testament, and it's the second time Jesus has used that verse to nail the Pharisees in Matthew's Gospel. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, to see what's going on here, remember the scene. Jesus and his disciples are walking on the Sabbath from the cornfield. The Pharisees are obviously with them or following them. And by verse 9, they arrive at the synagogue. That's the direction of travel. And these Pharisees were wealthy, well-to-do dudes. So presumably they would have had some cash on the hip. But when they see the hungry disciples, what do they not do? They don't shout at Jesus and go, Jesus, look, your disciples are hungry on this day of holy happiness. Let us use our cash to meet their needs. Let me use my riches to give them rest. Surely that's what they should have done. But now they are merciless rather than merciful. And so having ignored the disciples' need on the way and gone for condemnation rather than mercy, they arrive at the synagogue to worship God. And what does God say to them? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He says, if you're empty of mercy, then all your religious rituals are empty. Your sacrifice, your worship in the synagogue means nothing if you're not being merciful on the way here. And he says to these guys who are meant to be shepherds of God's people, do you think I'm happy with your worship here when there's sheep stuck in pits outside that you stepped over to get here? They're not just sabotaging rest for others. They are, in fact, self-sabotaging. In Matthew 23, Jesus will come back and speak to the same guys, saying, you yourselves don't enter, and nor will you let those enter who are trying to. That's a double tragedy. They're not enjoying the Sabbath rest, and they're not allowing anyone else to enjoy it either. Now, my guess is, for some of you who have been around churches, maybe when you were younger, this kind of stuff was probably the very thing that made you jack church in the first place. This is the kind of religion that put you off everything to do with Christianity. Something that's all burden and no blessing. Something that's all restrictions and no rest. Something that's all condemnation and no celebration. Any felt that? That's why I want to use, and I've started here, to use the ugliness of the Pharisees to show you the beauty of Jesus. Because he is so, so different. In this episode, you see Jesus fighting for your rest. In this episode, you see Jesus fighting to lift the burden again and get back to the blessing again. So I want to show you now, or let you hear, two things that Jesus says to you this morning. So having seen the ugliness of the Pharisees, full of condemnation, empty of rest, dedicated to sacrifices but devoid of mercy, listen to Jesus. He says to you, I am the Lord of rest. In response to the Pharisees, Jesus does what he often does. He uses this issue to reveal his own identity. And when Tim read it, you'll see in verses kind of 3 down to verse 8, he's using the Bible to establish who he is. Let me show you his logic. So he goes back to a time where David ate bread in the temple on the Sabbath, which was not lawful for him to do because he wasn't a priest. And Jesus is saying, if you Pharisees were around at the time of David and you applied the same logic to him as you've done to the disciples, you would have to condemn David as a lawbreaker. But Jesus says, who David was permitted what David did. He was the future Messiah king. And then he goes and talks about priests in the temple who had to work in the temple on the Sabbath so that other people could come to the temple on the Sabbath. And he says to the Pharisees, if you apply the same logic that you've done to Jesus and his disciples to the priests, you would have to condemn the priests as lawbreakers. But Jesus' argument again is who the priests are permits what the priests do. They're in the duty of God in his temple. That's the case Jesus is building. Who they were permitted what they did. He's applying it to himself. Who I am permits what I am doing. And he builds a case. Verses 3 and 4. I'm greater than David. Verse 5. I'm greater than priests. Verse 6. I'm greater even than the temple. Who I am permits what I do. And who is he? Look at verse 8. He explains it explicitly. First, the Son of Man. That is a claim, by the way, to absolute authority. Again, it's going back in the Bible to a book called Daniel, and it's retweeting that words to say, this is the person that God has given all power over all people for all time. That seriously would have pissed off the Pharisees. We don't like that, do we? You like authority over you? Of course not. That's why we boo the Pharisees as pampered villains. People with authority so often abuse their authority and use their authority to abuse me. But you need to see what Jesus does with his absolute authority. He is the Son of Man who says to you, I am the Lord of the what in verse 8? Lord of Sabbath. Lord of rest. He uses his absolute authority to give you rest. Now, in the heat of this debate, he is telling the Pharisees that he is the one who has authority to determine what the Sabbath means and not them. But at a far bigger level, he is saying, I'm not just taking authority from the Pharisees, I am using my authority for the sake of those who are weary and burdened. Here's the beauty of Jesus in contrast to the ugliness of the Pharisees. He uses his authority to give his people rest. He uses his authority to mercifully lift stupid sheep out of pits. As the Son of Man, he will use his authority to go to a cross to rescue people who have known nothing but slavery to sin. And if Jesus is the one who's got absolute authority, it means he can give you absolute rest. And if he's the one who's got absolute authority, it means he can protect you from anything and anyone who would steal that rest from you. I am the Lord of rest. In that class. But here's the second thing Jesus says to us here. It's not just I'm the Lord of rest. He says, I desire mercy. So we're moving from Jesus' identity to Jesus' desire in verse 7. What does Jesus want of those who have entered God's rest? He desires that those who have been saved by his mercy and brought into God's rest begin to show that mercy and share that rest. That's the point. He expects those of us who have experienced his mercy to generate an extension of mercy. Mercy is meant to multiply. Those who have been lifted out of a pit should help other people who are stuck in pits. That's the point, isn't it? He desires mercy. That's why this celebration is always an invitation. Who else needs rest? Who else requires mercy? Now, let's just stop. Do you see how different the Pharisees and Jesus are? So the Pharisees, full of condemnation, empty of rest. Jesus, full of authority, but the Lord of rest. The Pharisees, devoted to sacrifices, but devoid of mercy. Jesus, devoted to the duplication of mercy. Pharisees, functionally shutting the door to God's rest. Jesus, what does he do with the door? Flings the thing open and invites people in. Now, like last week, when we looked at Matthew 11, the big application here is, have you entered that rest? Have you gone through that door? Have you cried out to Jesus as a shepherd and said, Jesus, my stupidity and sin has got me stuck, maybe again. Jesus, lift me. And if you've not done that, today could be the day that you move from the slime to standing to singing. Cry out for his mercy. But I want to spend my time on something that's hit me this week that I think ought to hit us. And so I want us to see where this episode goes next. Shows us that this isn't just about us entering into Jesus' rest, but it's about how we engage with others who are in need of rest. Have a look at verse 10. We go on to this bit where we meet a man with a shriveled hand. So verse 10, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Now the NIV translation doesn't bring it out very well, but in the original language, in what Matthew is writing, he adds in the word here, behold. I'm presuming Matthew's like me. I think he would have been shouting at this point. Behold! Come on! You need to see this. Behold, a man with a shriveled hand was there. He's going to do it next week. If you look forward to verse 18, Kenny will show us this next week. Next week he's going to say, behold, Jesus. But at this stage he is saying, behold, a man with a shriveled hand. He's saying, look at his need. See him. See him like a sheep stuck in a pit. Do you behold him? Why does he want us to look at this guy? Because although Jesus and the Pharisees in the synagogue on that Sabbath are both looking at this same man with the same need in the same synagogue, they are seeing this man very differently. The Pharisees see this man. Imagine he's standing here. The Pharisees see him and they shut the door to God's rest on him. Jesus sees him and he flings the door open wide. The only value the Pharisees see in this man is that they can use him to keep their authority. But Jesus simply sees the value of the man and uses his authority to bring him to rest. The Pharisees use the law to keep him down and out. Jesus uses the law to lift him up and in. And the question I've felt Jesus asking me this week is, when we behold this man, are we seeing him like a Pharisee or are we seeing him like Jesus? And so I've got two questions I want us to wrestle with. Question number one. Are there ways that we, Pharisee-like, are shutting the door to God's rest on some people? So imagine different people come into GCC, not the synagogue 2,000 years ago, but GCC today. What is our instinct? What is our impulse when we see someone in need? Are we Pharisee-like? So when I see the notification that someone's asking for a lift to church, do I see that as an irritation to avoid rather than an opportunity to invite someone in? Or when I see a single mum come in struggling with high-energy kids, am I quicker to condemn her for the choices she's made in the past rather than help her enter into Jesus' rest in the present moment? Or when I see someone who's relapsed back into an old habit that's enslaved them, is my impulse to use God's law like a prosecutor, or is my instinct to invite them back into the freedom of God's rest? Or when I see someone who's proper upset on a Sunday, do I avoid them in case that interrupts my plans to collapse in front of the sofa for the football in the afternoon, rather than offering them an opportunity to come round and offload? Or when I see someone who's lost their temper at their family in the car on the way to church. Again, it happens, doesn't it? Do I use their unrighteousness as an opportunity to prune my self-righteousness, rather than empathizing with them and pointing them to the same mercy of Jesus that I need? Or if someone walks in who's stinking, hanging, and gouching, do I write them off as being beyond Jesus' mercy, because deep down I know that investing in them will exhaust me? Do I value my time more than I value them? Is what's in the Pharisees in us? And the actions may be different, but the attitudes can be exactly the same. I can fill God's commandments with condemnation, and I can empty them of rest. I can use God's law to prosecute and to keep them out. And I can be dedicated to religious rituals and empty of mercy. And I can use God's law to protect my right to rest. And I need to remember I was nothing more than a sheep stuck in a pit when he lifted me. And so the second question is, what are the ways that Jesus is inviting us to open the door to God's rest? Now, the Sabbath day that Jesus and his disciples are walking through in these cornfields, for them was a Saturday. But when Jesus rose from the dead on Resurrection Sunday, the Christian church made a switch from Sabbath Saturday to Resurrection Sunday. Although the day changed, the purpose didn't change. It was still to be a day celebrating what God had done in his creation and entering into the rest of his rescue. So when it made the move from Saturday to Sunday, it wasn't that the reasons for the celebration or the rest in the rescue lessened, it loudened, didn't it? Resurrection. Which means what? Sunday is the blessed day of rest. It is Celebration Sunday. It is Holy Happiness Day. One day in 7, Jesus opens a door to us and says in a special way, in a together way, come. Celebrate what your Creator's done in his creation. Enter into the rest of his rescue and the rest that is relating to him as Good Shepherd. And it is a right question for us to ask. What does God want us to do with this day? It's not a wrong thing to be like a Pharisee here and be precise and thorough about saying, what does God want us to do with this holy day? But here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to stand here now and say, don't do that, do this. Why? Would I end up playing the Pharisee? It's not about restrictions, it's about rest. So, we need to see, we will not find rest in doing nothing, and we will not find rest in doing mercy. We will find rest in coming to Jesus. Right? There are two paths we need to avoid. This holy day is not about doing nothing and making it a me thing, and it's not just about doing mercy and trying to do everything. It is about coming to him for everything. The door that Jesus is inviting us into is to find joy in him and rest in him and mercy from him. It's a beautiful day that Jesus puts as an interruption in our week to say, if you've got stuck in a pit in the last 6 days, this 7th day or first day is an opportunity for it to be an open door in the pit that you've got stuck in, to make sure that you don't stay in it longer than 6 days. Sunday is an open door to rescued rest. So here's the only thing I'm going to say we should try and do with a day of rest. We need to make it a day of happiness. A day where amidst the sadness of our life, we bring that sadness to find its joy in Jesus. I wonder if your mates in the community know that you look forward to a Sunday. And as well as being a day of happiness, we do need to make it a day of holiness. I think it ought to be different. Everybody else, same old shenanigans, different day. Do our family realize that we are buzzing for Resurrection Day? It's different for us. For those of us with kids, those of us with grandkids and that, do you think they can see that we use Sunday specially, not just to go to church, but to give it to God, to come to God? Happiness, holiness, that's where we find rest. But we can't leave without saying that Jesus doesn't just want it to be about happiness and holiness in us. He wants it to be a day of extending that mercy beyond us. He says, it is lawful to do good in the Sabbath. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, it's a law that you do good in the Sabbath. He says, it's lawful, it's allowed. Where you've got capacity and where there's opportunity, show the mercy that he's shown you. Do the mercy that he desires from you. Make the celebration an invitation. Multiply the mercy. See the power of the gospel lift other people out of their pits. I think the thing that struck me this week is this is an invitation from Jesus to share in his happiness. It's an opportunity for us to share Jesus' joy of bringing people out of brokenness and slavery and into restoration and rest. So what do we say on a Sunday? We say, oh, how blessed to be a sheep that's no longer stuck in a pit, but to have a shepherd Jesus, my Lord of rest. But more than that, it's to say with other rescued sheep, oh, how blessed it is that we have a shepherd Jesus, our Lord of rest. But then it's to say, oh, the blessing of being a blessing, and to bring other stuck sheep to find the shepherd Jesus, their Lord of rest.